Sarah Mitchell boarded the plane quietly, trying not to draw attention to herself. She held her old brown duffel bag tightly against her chest as she walked down the narrow aisle, looking for her seat. The bag had scratches and patches on it, a reminder of all the places she had been. Her jacket looked just as worn, soft leather that had clearly seen better days. To most people on the flight, she looked like an ordinary woman, maybe even a bit out of place among the business travelers dressed in suits and holding shiny laptops. The flight was from Dallas to Denver, a busy route filled with people heading to meetings, conferences, and family visits. Everyone seemed in a hurry, scrolling through their phones or talking loudly to colleagues. Sarah moved slowly, careful not to bump into anyone. She was used to being overlooked, and honestly, she didn't mind. Attention usually brought questions, and she didn't like talking much about herself. When she reached her seat near the front, she smiled politely at the man sitting next to her. A young executive with a silver watch and sharp tie. He gave her a quick nod before putting on his headphones. Across the aisle, two women were chatting about their new jobs and vacations. They glanced at Sarah's clothes and exchanged small, amused smiles. One of them whispered something, and they both laughed quietly. Sarah heard it, but she didn't react. She had learned long ago that people often judged what they didn't understand. Her hands rested in her lap, calm and still, though her eyes carried the weight of someone who had lived through more than most people ever would. She looked out the window as the ground crew loaded the last of the luggage. The sky was pale blue with soft white clouds, a beautiful day to fly. For her, the sight of an aircraft wing against the sky always brought a strange peace, like seeing an old friend. Sarah wasn't the kind of person who liked to talk about her past. To most people, she was just another quiet passenger on another ordinary flight. But her mind wasn't on the destination. It was on the rhythm of flight itself, the hum of the engines, the rush of wind, the mechanical sounds of takeoff. These were sounds she had once known better than anyone else. As the flight attendants walked down the aisle giving safety instructions, Sarah smiled again. She remembered the first time she had taken off alone in an aircraft, not a passenger plane but a fighter jet. That was more than a decade ago, back when her world revolved around speed, precision, and the roar of engines. But no one on this flight would ever guess that. They only saw what was on the surface. A middle-aged woman in a scuffed jacket who looked like she might fix cars for a living. Two young men in the row ahead started joking as the plane filled up. "Looks like we've got some old-school passengers today," one said, tilting his head toward Sarah. "Wonder if she's going to Denver to sell that jacket or just wearing it out of nostalgia." The other laughed. Sarah pretended not to hear, though the words stung a little. She wasn't angry, just quietly amused. People often laughed when they didn't know the story behind what they saw. The engines began to rumble, and Sarah's heart beat a little faster. Not from fear, but from habit. Her body recognized the vibrations before her mind did. She looked around at the passengers, people texting last-minute messages, checking their watches, adjusting their seats. Everyone seemed restless, impatient. But for Sarah, this was the moment she always loved most. The seconds before takeoff. The feeling of the plane gathering power, rising off the ground. It reminded her of who she used to be. As the plane lifted into the sky, she closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. The sound of the engines felt like music to her. It had been years since she had been in a cockpit, guiding a machine through the clouds, but she could still feel the controls beneath her hands, the firm resistance of metal and air. She smiled faintly, remembering the endless sky she once called her home. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and passengers began to settle in. The man next to her ordered coffee, the women across the aisle opened magazines, and the two young men ahead kept whispering jokes about passengers around them. Sarah ignored it all. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook. The cover was faded, and the pages were filled with handwritten notes and small drawings, diagrams of planes, flight routes, and checklists. She flipped through them slowly, her pen tapping against her knee. Anyone watching might have thought she was doodling or daydreaming, but what she was really doing was remembering. Every sketch had a story. The time she landed a fighter jet in a storm, the training drills she led, the moments of fear and triumph she rarely shared with anyone. Each page was a reminder of who she was before she chose a quieter life. She didn't need anyone's approval or attention, but if someone had looked closely, they might have noticed how her posture changed whenever the plane hit turbulence. The way her eyes instinctively scanned the cabin, alert but calm. She didn't panic like most passengers did. Instead, she seemed to come alive, focused, ready, as if her body remembered exactly what to do in an emergency. To the people around her, she was just a quiet woman on a plane. To herself, she was still a pilot, maybe not flying anymore, but still one at heart. She didn't know that in a few hours, the passengers who mocked her would see that side of her in a way they'd never forget. But for now, she just looked out the window, watching the clouds drift by, smiling softly at the endless sky that had once been hers. The plane had been in the air for almost 20 minutes when the soft laughter began. It started from the same row where the two young businessmen were sitting, the ones who had already made a few jokes before takeoff. They were both dressed sharply, their shirts perfectly pressed, watches shining, and hair neatly styled. They looked successful and confident, at least on the outside. Sarah noticed them out of the corner of her eye, but she didn't pay much attention at first. She was busy flipping through her little notebook again, tracing over an old sketch of an aircraft she once flew. Her handwriting was neat, her notes full of numbers, angles, and words like thrust, altitude, and stabilizer control. To her, these words were like poetry, but to anyone else, it probably just looked like a bunch of strange scribbles. One of the businessmen leaned toward the other and whispered, "She's been staring at that notebook since we took off. What do you think she's writing? A complaint letter?" The other laughed quietly. "Maybe she's making a list of things to fix. Looks like a mechanic's manual." They both snickered and shook their heads. Their laughter wasn't loud, but it carried just enough for Sarah to hear. She glanced up for a second and caught one of them looking at her. He quickly turned away, pretending to adjust his seatbelt. Sarah sighed softly and looked back down at her pages. She wasn't hurt, just a little disappointed. It wasn't the first time people had made quick judgments about her. A flight attendant came by with a friendly smile, offering drinks. "Would you like some coffee, ma'am?" she asked kindly. Sarah smiled back and nodded. "Yes, please. Just black." The young men in front exchanged looks again. One of them whispered, "Of course she drinks it black." The other laughed quietly behind his hand. Sarah pretended not to notice. The man sitting beside her, the one with the silver watch, seemed uncomfortable with the situation. He could tell what was going on but didn't know whether to say something. Instead, he buried his face in his tablet, pretending to read. Sarah took a sip of her coffee and stared out the window. The clouds outside looked soft, like cotton floating in endless blue. Her reflection appeared faintly in the glass, the calm face of a woman who had faced far worse than a few whispers on a plane. She remembered the times she had been underestimated before. The day she first walked into the Air Force Academy, surrounded by young men who thought she didn't belong there. Back then, the laughter had been louder, the doubts stronger. But she had learned to turn every smirk into motivation. She smiled slightly to herself. People saw only what they wanted to see. A quiet woman with rough hands and simple clothes. But they didn't see the years of training, the countless missions, the nights she had stayed awake guiding her jet through storms. They didn't see the medals tucked away in a box at home or the commander who once called her the calmest pilot he had ever met. Still, no matter how strong she was, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sting. Being judged never stopped hurting completely. She had just learned not to show it. She took another sip of coffee and focused on her breathing. Around her, the cabin buzzed with quiet conversations, the clicking of keyboards, the soft hum of the engines, and the low laughter of people who thought they were being clever. One of the flight attendants began explaining the lunch options. The same two men made another small joke about budget meals, and how some people probably aren't used to fancy flying. Their words were directed at no one in particular, but Sarah could tell they were looking her way again. She didn't respond, but something in her expression changed. Not anger, not sadness, but a quiet strength. Her eyes, which had seemed gentle before, suddenly looked sharp and focused. It was the same look she used to get in the cockpit right before takeoff. The man next to her noticed it and felt a strange sense of respect. He didn't know why, but something about this woman's calm made him uneasy, as if she knew something no one else did. He decided to break the silence. "Traveling for work?" he asked, trying to make conversation. Sarah looked at him and smiled politely. "No, just visiting an old friend," she said softly. Her voice was steady, low, and confident. There was something about the way she spoke. Slow but sure, like someone used to giving instructions that mattered. He nodded. "You seem very calm for someone who doesn't fly often," he said. Sarah chuckled lightly. "You could say I have some experience with flying," she replied, her tone playful but vague. The two young men overheard that and grinned at each other. "Experience with flying?" one muttered. "Maybe she worked at an airport gift shop." They laughed again, louder this time. Sarah didn't look at them. She just smiled slightly as if she knew something they didn't, which, in fact, she did. She looked back out the window and let her thoughts drift. She remembered the first time she had faced real turbulence in a jet, thousands of feet above the desert, engines roaring, alarms blaring, and how she had stayed calm, steady, focused. That same calm filled her now. The laughter behind her faded into the background. The plane was still climbing, smooth and steady, the engines humming like an old song. Sarah leaned back in her seat, closed her eyes for a moment, and thought about how strange life was. Here she was, a woman who had once flown faster than the speed of sound, sitting quietly among people who thought they understood the sky better than she did. Little did they know that before this flight ended, those same people would be looking to her for help. They would see her not as someone to laugh at, but as someone to rely on, the one person on the plane who could stay calm when the world began to shake. For now, though, Sarah just smiled softly and watched the clouds drift by, letting them think whatever they wanted. She knew that soon, everything would change. The plane was now high above the clouds, moving smoothly through the sky. The seatbelt sign had turned off, and the passengers had relaxed into their routines. Some were watching movies, others were chatting quietly, and a few had already fallen asleep with their headphones on. The cabin was filled with a soft hum, the steady sound of the engines that comforted most travelers but meant something very different to Sarah Mitchell. For Sarah, that sound was like a heartbeat. It reminded her of home, of all the years she had spent in cockpits, surrounded by buttons, switches, and flashing lights. Flying wasn't just a way to travel for her. It was something she understood deeply, almost like second nature. Even though she was just a passenger now, she still found herself paying attention to every little detail. The angle of the plane, the tone of the engine, the way the flight attendants moved when turbulence might be coming. She glanced around. The same two young businessmen who had laughed at her earlier were still whispering and chuckling now and then, but their voices had faded into the background noise. Sarah didn't care anymore. She was lost in her thoughts, watching the sunlight reflect off the airplane's silver wing. The world outside looked peaceful, miles of open blue sky, soft white clouds rolling like waves below. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that reminded her why she had loved being a pilot. She remembered the quiet moments in the air, far above everything. No noise, no people, just the steady hum of the jet and the endless horizon. She used to say that flying was the closest thing to freedom she had ever felt. A flight attendant rolled a food cart down the aisle, smiling politely as she handed out meals. "Chicken or pasta?" she asked. Sarah smiled and chose pasta, thanking her kindly. The young man next to her, the one with the tablet, looked a little nervous. He had seemed calm earlier, but now he was tapping his leg and glancing out the window too often. Sarah noticed. "Not a fan of flying?" she asked gently. He gave a short laugh. "Not really. I trust the pilots, but I don't know. Something about being this high up makes me uneasy." Sarah nodded knowingly. "That's normal. But trust me, you're in good hands. Planes are much stronger than most people think." He smiled a little. "You sound like you know a thing or two about that." Sarah just smiled back but didn't answer. She didn't feel the need to brag or explain. The truth was, she knew exactly how it felt to sit in a pilot's seat and feel the weight of hundreds of lives behind her. She knew how it felt to hear an engine warning, to make a split-second decision, to stay calm when everyone else panicked. But she kept that part of herself quiet. As the passengers ate, laughter and small talk filled the air. A baby cried somewhere in the back, and a mother gently hushed it. A group of friends took selfies, trying to fit the airplane window in the background. It was a normal flight, calm, routine, predictable. Sarah opened her notebook again. Inside were hand-drawn diagrams of aircraft wings and flight control systems. She had been working on something for a while. A small guide she wanted to share with young pilots one day. She had promised herself she'd finish it on this trip. She took her pen and started writing in neat, slow letters. In the air, confidence doesn't come from pride. It comes from preparation. The words made her think of her training days. The drills, the noise, the endless hours of practice. She remembered one of her instructors telling her, "A pilot's real test doesn't come when things go right. It comes when everything goes wrong." She didn't know that those words would soon come true again, right here on this very flight. A light turbulence made the plane shake slightly. A few passengers gasped, clutching their armrests. The flight attendant's calm voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts. We're just passing through a bit of rough air." Sarah didn't even flinch. She fastened her belt and continued writing. She had flown through storms that made this feel like a gentle breeze. But she noticed something, a faint change in the tone of the engines. It was something most passengers wouldn't hear or care about, but she recognized it immediately. It was subtle, but it made her look up, her trained instincts quietly alert. She glanced toward the cockpit door. Everything seemed fine. The attendants were still calm. The passengers relaxed again. Sarah shook her head and smiled to herself. Old habits die hard, she thought. Her ears had become so used to reading engine sounds that even a small change caught her attention. To distract herself, she looked around the cabin again. The two young men in front were showing each other something funny on their phones. The older woman across the aisle was knitting. Life inside the plane felt normal, safe, just another flight among thousands happening that day. Sarah leaned back and closed her eyes for a while. She let the low vibration of the aircraft fill her mind. She remembered the countless missions she had flown in her past life, some peaceful, others tense. She remembered nights flying under starlit skies, the radio crackling softly in her ear. She remembered landing her fighter jet after a long mission, the adrenaline still rushing through her body. Even though she was retired now, that part of her never really went away. She still carried herself like a pilot, calm, sharp, and always ready. But as she rested, something strange happened. The plane shook again, a little harder this time. A few people gasped louder. The flight attendant hurried down the aisle to make sure everyone was seated. The seatbelt light came back on with a soft ding. Sarah's eyes opened instantly. She could feel it. Something wasn't quite right. It wasn't just normal turbulence this time. The vibration was uneven, off rhythm. Her calm gaze shifted toward the wing outside the window. It looked fine, but deep down, her instincts told her that the next few minutes would not be ordinary. She didn't say anything. Not yet. She didn't want to alarm anyone. But inside, a quiet thought formed in her mind. A thought she hadn't had in years. If something goes wrong, I'll be ready. And without knowing it, that moment of calm before the storm was coming to an end. Very soon, everyone on that plane would realize how lucky they were to have Sarah Mitchell sitting among them. The plane had been flying smoothly for almost an hour when it happened. At first, it was just a small vibration, barely noticeable. Most passengers didn't even look up. Sarah, however, felt it instantly. It was a different kind of shake, sharper, more uneven. Her eyes opened, alert but calm. She had felt this kind of movement before, years ago, in the cockpit of a fighter jet when something wasn't working right. A few seconds later, the lights flickered. The soft hum of the engine changed tone, becoming rough and strained. A few people began to whisper nervously. The flight attendants, still smiling, tried to stay calm as they walked quickly toward their stations. Then came a sudden, heavy jolt. The entire plane dipped to one side before leveling again. Passengers screamed. Coffee spilled. Trays slid off tables, and a child began to cry. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We're experiencing a small technical issue. Everything is under control." But Sarah knew that voice. She could hear the tightness in it, the kind of controlled tone a pilot used when trying to hide real concern. She looked toward the front of the cabin. The attendants were whispering to each other now, their eyes wide. The businessman sitting next to her looked terrified. "What's happening?" he asked, gripping the armrest. Sarah kept her voice steady. "It might just be an engine problem. Planes can fly even if one engine fails. Don't worry yet." But deep down, she knew it might be more than that. The sound of the engine wasn't normal anymore. It was sputtering unevenly, and the vibrations were getting stronger. Another jolt hit, harder this time. The lights blinked, and the oxygen masks dropped down suddenly from the ceiling. Gasps filled the cabin. People panicked, fumbling with the yellow masks, their voices trembling with fear. The captain's voice returned, louder this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, please stay calm and keep your masks on. We are handling the situation." The plane started to descend slightly, not fast but noticeably. The once smooth hum of the engines had turned into a harsh growl. Sarah tightened her seatbelt and looked around. The two young men who had mocked her earlier were white-faced and shaking. One of them was whispering prayers under his breath. A flight attendant moved down the aisle, holding onto the seats to keep her balance. Her face was pale, but she was trying to look brave. "Please, everyone, remain calm," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "We're working with the captain to fix this." Sarah could tell that the situation was worse than they were letting on. She saw the cockpit door open slightly as the co-pilot stepped out for a moment. He looked pale, sweat on his forehead. He whispered something urgently to the head flight attendant, who gasped. Sarah watched them closely, reading their body language like she had done so many times during emergency briefings. The co-pilot's hands were trembling slightly. That wasn't a good sign. Then, for the first time, she heard him say it. Not loudly, but just enough for her sharp ears to catch. "We've lost hydraulic control. The captain needs manual assistance." Her heart skipped a beat. Hydraulic control was what allowed the pilot to move the plane's flaps, rudder, and landing gear. Without it, the plane couldn't steer properly. It was one of the worst failures that could happen midair. The head attendant looked terrified. "What do we do?" she whispered. The co-pilot swallowed hard. "We need help. Someone who's flown manually before." "The captain is asking." He looked down the aisle, scanning the passengers. "Is there any fighter pilot on board?" The words hung in the air, echoing through the tense cabin. For a second, no one said anything. People looked around, confused, frightened. The two young men stopped whispering. The businessman next to Sarah froze. Then Sarah slowly unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood up, steady and calm, even as the plane shook again. Every head turned toward her. She took a breath and said firmly, "I'm a former Air Force pilot." The co-pilot's eyes widened in shock. "You are?" Sarah nodded. 12 years of flight experience. F-16s. "If the captain needs manual assistance, I can help." The flight attendants quickly cleared the aisle. People stared at her in disbelief. The same passengers who had laughed at her earlier were now silent, their eyes full of fear and guilt. The plane shuddered again, the overhead bins rattling. Sarah steadied herself and started walking toward the cockpit. The co-pilot motioned her forward quickly. "Please," he said, his voice desperate. "We've lost pressure in the right engine system. The captain could use your hands." As Sarah passed the rows of terrified passengers, she could feel all their eyes on her. Some were whispering, "She's a pilot?" Others simply prayed. She didn't look back. Her mind had already shifted into focus. Every step toward the cockpit felt familiar, like walking back into the place she truly belonged. Her calmness stood in sharp contrast to the chaos around her. She wasn't afraid. Her training, her instincts, and her years of experience were coming back like muscle memory. When she entered the cockpit, she saw the captain struggling with the controls, sweat on his face. The warning lights blinked red across the panel. He glanced at her, relief flooding his eyes. "You're the pilot?" he asked quickly. Sarah nodded. "I am. Tell me what we've got." He pointed to the screen. "Hydraulics are gone. Right engine pressure dropping. We're trying to stabilize manually." Sarah took the co-pilot seat, her hands moving confidently across the controls. "All right," she said calmly. "Let's bring her down steady. Follow my lead." The captain nodded without hesitation. The two pilots, one official, one unexpected, began working together in perfect rhythm. Sarah adjusted the flaps by instinct, reading the aircraft's behavior as if she had never stopped flying. Outside the cockpit, the passengers waited in fearful silence. Every shake, every sound made someone flinch. No one laughed anymore. The two young businessmen sat with their hands clasped tightly, their eyes red. The man who had sat beside Sarah whispered to himself, "Please let her do this." And in that moment, 30,000 feet above the ground, the woman they had once mocked was now the one keeping them alive. The storm wasn't over yet, but for the first time since it began, there was hope, because Sarah Mitchell was back where she belonged, in the pilot's seat. The air inside the plane felt heavy with fear. Every small sound, a creak, a thud, a beep, made people hold their breath. The captain's last announcement, "Is there any fighter pilot on board?" still echoed in everyone's mind. And now, they had watched in disbelief as the quiet woman they had mocked earlier stood up and calmly walked toward the cockpit. Sarah Mitchell stepped through the narrow aisle, holding onto the seatbacks for balance. The plane shook again, harder this time, but her steps didn't falter. Her face was calm, her eyes focused. Behind her, the passengers watched silently, their fear mixing with awe. No one spoke. Even the two young businessmen who had laughed at her earlier were frozen in shock. One of them whispered to the other, "She said she's a pilot? A real one." The flight attendants quickly cleared the way, their faces pale but hopeful. The co-pilot guided Sarah to the cockpit, closing the door behind them. The chaos of the cabin disappeared, replaced by the sharp beeping of alarms and the flashing red lights on the control panel. The captain looked up, relief flooding his tired face. "You're the fighter pilot?" he asked, his voice tight. "Yes," Sarah replied calmly, sliding into the co-pilot's seat. "Tell me the situation." "We lost hydraulic control about 5 minutes ago," the captain said quickly. "The right engine pressure's dropping, and we're losing altitude faster than I want." Sarah's hands moved confidently over the controls, her fingers steady. She read the instruments with practiced eyes, understanding everything instantly. "All right," she said firmly. "Let's keep her level. Manual control's tricky at this height, but we can do it." The captain nodded, visibly calming under her leadership. Together, they began to work in sync, adjusting pressure valves, rerouting power, balancing the weight of the aircraft. The plane continued to tremble, but it started to respond to their actions. Meanwhile, in the cabin, fear had turned into tense silence. People were holding hands, whispering prayers. A child asked her mother in a small voice, "Is the plane going to fall?" The mother hugged her close and said, "No, sweetheart. That lady went to help. She's going to save us." The passengers wanted to believe that. They needed to. Every few minutes, the plane shook again, and people closed their eyes, waiting for the next announcement. But none came. Behind that closed cockpit door, Sarah was fighting with everything she had learned in years of flying. "Engine pressure's stabilizing a little," the captain said, his voice hopeful. "Good," Sarah replied. "Keep it steady. I'll try to adjust the flaps manually." Her hands moved fast and sure, flipping switches and pressing buttons with precision. The captain watched her, amazed by her confidence. She wasn't guessing. She knew what to do. "How long since you last flew?" he asked in disbelief. Sarah gave a small smile without taking her eyes off the panel. "Too long," she said. "But flying never leaves you. It's like breathing. Once you learn, it stays with you." Outside, the sky had turned gray. The plane passed through a layer of thick clouds, lightning flashing in the distance. The turbulence grew worse. The plane shook violently, making some passengers scream. Drinks spilled, bags fell from the overhead bins. Sarah's voice cut through the noise. "We're hitting crosswinds. Keep her level." The captain gripped the control column with both hands, following her lead. "You've done this before," he said. "More times than I can count," she replied calmly. Her heart was racing, but her mind was sharp. Every part of her training came back, the drills, the emergencies, the impossible landings. She had done this in storms, in combat zones, even when her life had depended on it. This time, hundreds of lives depended on her. The warning alarms beeped again. "Altitude dropping, 15,000 feet, the captain said. "We need to start planning our descent," Sarah said quickly. "Nearest airport?" The co-pilot's voice crackled through the radio. "Closest one is in Wichita Falls. Runway's clear, weather's moderate." "Good," Sarah said. "Let's prepare for emergency landing procedures." The captain nodded. "You take manual control?" Sarah took a deep breath and said, "Yes, I'll fly." He didn't hesitate. "You've got it." Her hands gripped the control column. The weight of the entire aircraft pressed through her arms. But she didn't waver. Every vibration, every sound told her what the plane needed. She spoke to it under her breath, something she used to do back in the Air Force. "Come on, girl. Stay with me." The captain followed her commands, adjusting as she guided. "Flaps at 20 degrees, she said. "Throttle steady. Don't fight the turbulence. Flow with it." The plane began to stabilize, slowly but surely. The passengers didn't know what was happening, but they could feel the difference. The shaking was still there, but it was less violent now. The woman across the aisle whispered, "It's working. The plane feels steadier." The two young men who had mocked Sarah sat in silence, guilt written all over their faces. "We laughed at her," one of them said quietly. The other nodded, his eyes red. "And now she's saving us." Back in the cockpit, Sarah's focus didn't break for a second. Sweat ran down her forehead, but her hands stayed steady. The captain watched her with respect. "You're incredible," he said softly. Sarah shook her head. "No, just experienced." The control column jerked again. Another burst of turbulence. The plane tilted slightly. A loud beep filled the cockpit. The captain cursed under his breath. "Left hydraulic pressure failing again," he said. "All right," Sarah replied quickly. "We can compensate with the right engine thrust. Follow my lead." She adjusted the controls, feeling the resistance. The plane groaned but began to respond. Slowly, the tilt leveled out. The ground below started coming into view through breaks in the clouds. "There," Sarah said. "We've got a visual." The captain exhaled in relief. "Wichita Falls Airport, I see it. We're clear for emergency landing." Sarah nodded, her eyes locked on the runway far below. "Then let's bring them home." As the plane began its descent, the passengers clutched their seats, praying, crying, hoping. No one spoke loudly. No laughter, no mockery, just silence and trust in the stranger who had stood up when everyone else froze. In that moment, the simple woman they had laughed at was no longer just another passenger. She was their hero, calm, steady, and brave in the face of fear. And though the danger wasn't over yet, one thing was certain. With Sarah Mitchell in the cockpit, they had a fighting chance. Inside the cockpit, the tension was so thick that even the sound of breathing seemed loud. The plane had stopped shaking as violently, but the danger wasn't over. Warning lights still blinked across the dashboard, and the captain's voice was tight with focus. Sarah sat beside him, her hands steady on the controls, her eyes sharp and calm. Every movement she made was quick but precise. The captain glanced at her again, amazed. "You said you flew fighter jets?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly as he adjusted a lever. "Yes," Sarah said, her eyes still fixed on the instruments. "F-16s. Mostly combat missions." The co-pilot turned around from the radio, staring at her. "You're military?" he asked in disbelief. "I was," she replied simply. 12 years in the Air Force." The captain shook his head in awe. "Well, I've flown with a lot of people, but I've never seen hands that steady during a failure like this. Sarah smiled faintly. That's the thing about fighter pilots, she said. We're trained to stay calm even when everything is falling apart. Outside the cockpit, the storm clouds were thinning, revealing patches of blue sky. But the plane was still flying low and heavy, and they were running on limited power. The airport was about 20 minutes away. They needed to keep control until then. In the cabin, passengers sat in silence. Some were praying softly. Others clutched their seats, eyes shut tight. The air smelled faintly of coffee and fear. Every few seconds, someone looked toward the cockpit door, wondering what was happening behind it. The businessman who had sat next to Sarah earlier stared at that door with a strange mix of guilt and admiration. He remembered how she had sat so quietly, how people had laughed at her. Now he felt ashamed. She's the reason we're still alive, he whispered to himself. The two young men who had mocked her were pale and silent. One of them finally spoke, his voice shaky. We laughed at her. She didn't even say anything back. The other nodded. She knew we were idiots and still went to save us. At that moment, the intercom came on. The captain's voice was calm but filled with emotion. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've had a serious technical failure, but we're currently stabilizing the aircraft. I want you all to remain calm and keep your seatbelts fastened. We also have someone very special assisting us. A former Air Force fighter pilot who's helping bring this plane down safely. Gasps filled the cabin. People looked at each other in shock. The quiet woman in the old leather jacket, the one they had ignored, judged, and whispered about, was the one flying the plane. The older woman sitting across the aisle put her hand over her heart. "Oh my goodness," she said softly. "That woman, she's saving us." A young mother began crying quietly, holding her baby close. "Thank God she was here," she whispered. Even the flight attendants, who had tried so hard to stay professional, exchanged tearful looks of relief. For the first time since the turbulence began, hope filled the cabin. Meanwhile, inside the cockpit, Sarah's focus didn't waver. The captain monitored the pressure gauges while she adjusted the plane's tilt. "We're getting crosswinds again," she said. "We'll have to adjust the angle slightly on descent." The captain nodded. "I'll follow your lead." Sarah took a deep breath and placed her hands firmly on the controls. "We can do this," she said. "Just stay calm." The ground control's voice crackled over the radio. "Flight 728, you're cleared for emergency landing. Runway 27 is ready. Winds from the southwest at 15 knots. "Copy that," Sarah replied smoothly. Her voice was strong and confident, the kind of voice that could calm anyone, even in a storm. The captain smiled faintly. "You sound like you never left the sky." Sarah's lips curved into a small smile. "Once you've flown, it never leaves you. The sky becomes a part of who you are." The plane began its descent. The clouds outside were now behind them, and the ground was slowly becoming visible, patches of fields, roads, and the faint line of the runway in the distance. In the cabin, passengers could feel the change. The descent was smoother now. The violent shaking had stopped. People started whispering prayers of thanks, some even clapping softly in relief. The businessman looked at the two young men in front of him and said quietly, "You see her? That's real strength. Not fancy clothes or big talk, just quiet confidence." One of the young men nodded shamefully. "We misjudged her." The plane dipped slightly as Sarah adjusted for wind speed. The alarms beeped once, but she quickly recalibrated the system. Her hands moved fast, calm, precise. She didn't even flinch. The captain watched her in awe, shaking his head. "You've got nerves of steel," he said. Sarah smiled. "Comes with the job." They were now just a few minutes from landing. Sarah's heart beat steadily, but her face stayed calm. She thought of all the times she had done this before. Landing in rough weather, guiding damaged jets to safety. She thought of her team back in the Air Force, of the missions that had taught her to stay strong no matter what. "Altitude 6,000 feet, the captain announced. "Copy," Sarah said. "Flaps at 30. Gear down." The sound of the landing gear lowering filled the cockpit. The plane trembled again, but this time, Sarah controlled it perfectly. She guided it with the kind of touch that only years of experience could teach. In the cabin, people held their breath as they felt the plane lowering. Through the windows, they could see the airport runway growing larger and closer. "We're almost there," Sarah said softly, her eyes locked on the horizon. The captain smiled with admiration. "You know, I think everyone on this flight owes you their life." Sarah didn't answer. She was too focused. But inside, she felt something warm. Not pride, just peace. She hadn't planned to be a hero that day. She had only wanted a quiet flight. But fate had other ideas. As the plane approached the runway, everything inside the cabin was silent. No one dared to move or breathe too loudly. All eyes were on the front, on the woman who had once been invisible. Now the only reason they had hope. Sarah took one last deep breath, hands firm on the controls. "We're going to land this plane," she whispered to herself. "Nice and easy." And as the runway lights grew brighter below, everyone on that plane, from the captain to the passengers who had once laughed, silently prayed for the woman who had turned fear into courage. The revelation was complete. The simple woman they had mocked was a fighter pilot, calm, brave, and unstoppable. The runway was now in sight, long, straight, and shining faintly under the gray clouds. The passengers could see it through the small windows, and their hearts began to beat faster. They were close to safety, but still, everyone knew that one wrong move could mean disaster. Inside the cockpit, the tension was unbearable. Every light, every sound, every vibration mattered. Sarah's eyes were fixed on the runway ahead. Her hands gripped the controls tightly but with calm precision. The captain sat beside her, following her instructions. Sweat rolled down his temple as he kept an eye on the instrument panel. "Wind speed's increasing," he said. "I see it," Sarah replied calmly. "We'll have to angle slightly to the left. Keep the throttle steady." The plane rattled again, dipping slightly as a gust of wind pushed against its side. Gasps filled the cabin. Someone screamed softly, and a baby began to cry. But Sarah didn't flinch. Her voice came through the intercom, steady and clear. "Everyone, please remain calm and stay seated with your seatbelts fastened. We're making our final approach. Everything will be all right." Her calm voice spread through the plane like a wave of comfort. The passengers, terrified only moments ago, felt something shift. They believed her. Somehow, the way she spoke made them trust that she could bring them home safely. The captain looked at her, impressed. "You're a natural leader," he said quietly. Sarah gave a small smile without looking away from the window. "In the Air Force, we learned that people don't follow words. They follow calm." The co-pilot monitored the systems. "Hydraulic pressure's still low, but holding," he said. "Landing gears locked." "Good," Sarah replied. "We'll take this slow. No sudden moves." The ground grew closer and closer. The runway lights blinked ahead, guiding them down through the mist. Sarah's eyes didn't blink once. She could feel every movement of the plane through her hands, the way the wind pushed, the way the wings tilted. It was like the aircraft was speaking to her, and she was listening. The captain called out, "Altitude 1,000 feet." Sarah nodded. "Flaps to 40. Reduce speed to 145 knots. He followed her command instantly. The engines roared softly as the plane slowed down. The passengers could feel the descent. Slow, careful, and heavy. In the cabin, silence filled the air. A woman clutched a small cross in her hand, whispering prayers. A man closed his eyes and held his wife's hand tightly. The little boy from earlier peered out the window and whispered, "We're almost home, Mommy." The plane hit another pocket of turbulence. It jerked hard to the left, throwing some passengers against their seatbelts. A few people screamed, but Sarah's voice came calmly. "Hold steady. We're all right." Her focus was absolute. Every second mattered. The captain's voice was tight. 500 feet. "Steady," Sarah whispered. "Almost there." The wind hit again, stronger this time. The plane tilted dangerously to one side. The warning alarm began to beep loudly. "Crosswinds too strong," the captain shouted. "I've got it," Sarah said firmly. She tightened her grip, her muscles straining as she adjusted the controls. Her mind flashed back to her fighter jet training, emergency landings in storms, winds stronger than this under enemy fire. She remembered her commander's words, "Trust your instincts. Trust your hands." She angled the plane slightly against the wind, guiding it back to level flight. The wings steadied. The beeping stopped. The runway was just seconds away. 200 feet, the captain said, voice trembling. Sarah's tone was calm and steady. "We're going to land this. Keep flaps down. Prepare for touchdown." The passengers braced themselves. Some closed their eyes, others gripped their seats. A few began to cry silently, whispering words of thanks under their breath. The plane's shadow grew larger on the runway below. Then, thud, the wheels touched down, hard but controlled. The plane bounced once, then steadied. Screams filled the air. Not of fear this time, but of relief. The engines roared as Sarah pulled back on the thrust levers, slowing the plane down. The brakes hissed loudly. "Speed reducing," the captain called out. 100 knots, 70, 50. Sarah nodded, her hands firm. "We're on the ground," she said softly. The plane finally came to a full stop. The cabin erupted with cheers, clapping, and cries of joy. People hugged each other, tears running down their faces. The flight attendants began to smile through their own tears. In the cockpit, the captain leaned back in his seat and let out a long breath. "That was incredible," he said, looking at Sarah. "You just saved hundreds of lives." Sarah smiled faintly, her heart pounding. "We all did," she said. "Teamwork." The captain shook his head. "No, you did it. You flew that plane like it was part of you." Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes softening. "It's been a long time since I've been in a cockpit," she said quietly. "But it feels like coming home." Outside, emergency vehicles raced toward the plane, lights flashing. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the runway, ready for the worst. But there was no fire, no smoke, no crash. Just a safe landing and hundreds of lives saved. In the cabin, passengers were still clapping. Someone shouted, "Who's the woman who flew the plane?" Another voice answered proudly, "She's a fighter pilot." The businessman stood up, eyes filled with emotion. "She's the woman we laughed at," he said loudly. "And she just saved us all." People turned toward the cockpit, their faces glowing with gratitude and awe. The young men who had mocked her earlier sat in silence, their eyes wet with shame. The captain opened the cockpit door, and Sarah stepped out slowly. The moment the passengers saw her, they began to clap louder. The sound grew, filling the plane with applause, cheers, and tears. Sarah looked around, her heart full. She didn't want praise. She didn't want attention. She was just glad everyone was alive. She gave a small, humble smile and said softly, "We made it." People stood up, clapping and cheering. The sound echoed through the cabin. Not just a thank you, but an apology too. As the crew guided everyone to exit safely, the captain turned to Sarah and said, "You're a hero, you know." Sarah shook her head gently. "I'm just a pilot," she said, "doing what I was trained to do." But everyone on that plane knew the truth. She wasn't just a pilot. She was the reason they were still alive. The laughter that had once mocked her was now replaced with respect, admiration, and gratitude. And as she stepped off the plane, the world outside seemed to glow a little brighter. The storm was over, both in the sky and in the hearts of everyone she had just saved. The smell of rain filled the air as passengers stepped off the plane one by one. The runway was wet from the storm that had passed, and the clouds were finally breaking apart, letting the evening sun peek through. The light hit the damaged plane, making it look like a survivor after a long, hard battle. Firefighters and emergency crews stood nearby, amazed that the aircraft had landed safely despite the technical failure. Inside, Sarah Mitchell sat quietly in one of the front seats, her hands resting on her lap. Her body was exhausted, but her heart was calm. Around her, people were hugging, crying, calling their families and thanking God. Some even took pictures, trying to capture the miracle that had just happened. The captain came over to her, his eyes full of respect. "Sarah," he said softly, "you saved every single person on this flight. We all owe you our lives." Sarah smiled humbly. "We worked together," she said. "You kept the crew calm, and that helped me focus." The captain shook his head. "No, you did what most pilots couldn't. You flew a failing aircraft through a storm and landed it safely without full control. That's extraordinary." Sarah gave a small laugh, tired but warm. "It's just training," she said, "and a bit of luck." By now, airport officials and emergency workers had gathered around. News reporters had already arrived, cameras flashing as they tried to find out what happened. A few passengers pointed towards Sarah, saying, "That's her. That's the woman who saved us." The same young man who had mocked her earlier walked toward her slowly, his face red with shame. He looked like he had been crying. When he reached her, he swallowed hard and said, I'm sorry." Sarah looked up at him gently. "For what?" she asked. "For being stupid," he said. "For laughing at you. I didn't know who you were." Sarah shook her head. "It doesn't matter who I am," she said softly. "What matters is how we treat people, especially when we don't know their story." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "You're right," he whispered. "And you're amazing." The older woman who had defended Sarah on the plane came over next. She hugged her tightly and said, "I knew there was something special about you. Thank you, dear. You gave us all another chance at life." Sarah hugged her back with a smile. "I'm just glad you're safe." Soon, reporters began to gather around her, microphones ready. "Miss, is it true you were the one who landed the plane?" one of them asked. "Yes," Sarah said simply. "And you're a fighter pilot?" another reporter shouted. "I was," Sarah replied. "U.S. Air Force, 12 years. I retired a few years ago." Cameras clicked rapidly. "What made you decide to help today?" a journalist asked. Sarah looked at the damaged plane behind her and said quietly, "When you've been trained to save lives, you don't think. You just act. It doesn't matter if you're in a fighter jet or a passenger plane. If people are in danger, you do what you can." Her calm, humble words spread quickly. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Former fighter pilot saves 180 lives on passenger flight. People on social media called her the angel in the sky. But for Sarah, fame meant nothing. She didn't stay to give more interviews. After the officials finished their reports and the passengers were taken to safety, she quietly walked out of the terminal with her small travel bag. The captain caught up to her just before she left. "Where will you go now?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Home," she said. "Back to a quiet life. I think I've had enough excitement for one day." He laughed softly. "You've earned 1,000 quiet days after this." Sarah nodded, then turned toward the exit. As she walked out into the cool evening air, the sun was setting behind the clouds, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. At the same time, back inside the airport, passengers still couldn't stop talking about her. Some cried when they told their families what had happened. A few even wrote posts online, describing how a simple woman had turned out to be their savior. The businessman who had sat next to her gave a small interview to a reporter. His voice shook with emotion. "We all judged her," he said. "She looked quiet, ordinary, not the kind of person you'd notice. But when it mattered, she was the bravest of all of us. She's the reason we're alive." "I'll never forget that." Others nodded in agreement. They had learned something deep that day, that you can never truly know someone by how they look or act on the surface. The person you ignore might be the one who saves your life. Later that night, Sarah reached her small home on the edge of town. Her old dog ran up to her, wagging its tail. She knelt down and hugged it tightly. The house was quiet. No reporters, no noise, just peace. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, looking up at the stars. Her phone buzzed with dozens of missed calls and messages. From the airline, from news agencies, from people wanting to thank her. But she didn't reply. She didn't need attention or praise. She whispered softly to herself, "They're safe. That's enough." Her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of relief. She thought of the passengers' faces, the fear in their eyes turning into hope. She thought of the laughter that had once filled the plane and how it had changed into applause. For Sarah, that moment, when the wheels had touched the runway and everyone had lived, would stay with her forever. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that maybe the world had needed this reminder. That courage doesn't always wear a uniform, and heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes, they sit quietly by the window seat, reading a book, waiting for a moment when their heart tells them it's time to rise. And as the night sky darkened outside, Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the peace that comes after a storm. She wasn't looking for medals or headlines or applause. She just wanted people to remember one thing, that kindness and bravery can come from anyone, even the ones you least expect. That night, as she turned off the light and lay down to rest, Sarah smiled. The world could call her a hero if it wanted. But in her heart, she was just a pilot who did her duty, one more time. And for the 180 souls she brought safely home, that was more than enough.